You know, the good thing about the time we spend in prayer, of course, is not wasted time. The Lord has heard everything that we have said, and He will also answer those things according to His will. We already know that we have what we have asked. Let's turn in our Bibles now to Daniel chapter 8. I have in your bulletin 11, but 11 is just too long, I think, to read this morning. So let's focus on chapter 8 because it does cover the same ground that we're going to be looking at this morning. I'd like to read Daniel 8, verses 1 through 14. And as last week we were seeing some of the things that the Lord did to further the work of His gospel through allowing Greece to become a world-dominating empire. We're going to see at least, three situations this morning that were not quite so good, as it were, as Greece tried to exterminate the Jews, but how the Lord protected them. Okay, so there were good things and bad things. And the one that we're going to read about in particular in Daniel chapter 8 has to do with that very infamous name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was, again, one who desecrated the temple, tried to exterminate the Jews, but the Lord delivered His people. Let me read for you Daniel 8, beginning in verse 1 through verse 14. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. And I looked in the vision, and it came about while I was looking that I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai canal. Then I lifted my gaze and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes, and he came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and toward the beautiful land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." May the Lord bless this reading of His Word and the preaching of His Word this morning. I think you'll recognize this as the text that I read last week, and I hope some of these symbols reminded you of what we heard about last week in the conquering of the world, basically by the Grecian Empire, represented by the goat. The ram with the 2 horns represented the existing world power at the time, which was Persia, or Medio-Persia. Represents basically these 2 kingdoms united together in one, which is why there were the 2 horns. But the fact that the goat came swiftly showed the swiftness of Alexander the Great's conquest of the world and his destruction of that existing world empire. That was represented by the horn. But then, of course, the horn is broken into 4 horns, and we'll see how that works out. And then the one small horn that grows out of one of the four, which is not the Antichrist, but it is Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay. Well, first of all, let's remind ourselves that we're continuing to look at the Lord's preparation of the world for the coming of His Son. Now, 2 weeks ago, we considered that He closed the Old Testament canon. The inspired account of His work was basically finished. His work up to that time was done, at least the part He was intending to record, and nothing more needed to be recorded, so the Lord basically sealed up the Old Testament canon. The spirit of revelation ceased. But it didn't cease until He had completed the prophetic account of what was going to happen next. Remember, He added the last book was Malachi. Malachi is a prophetic book. The Lord, whenever He is silent for a while, He always tells us what's going to happen down the road. He never leaves His people completely in the dark as to what is going to happen next. He always lets them know what's on the horizon so they'll be ready for it. Now, currently, we're studying the time frame that is covered by that prophecy. The canon was closed 400 years before that silence was broken by the coming of the angel to announce the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ, before it was broken perhaps even more fully by the preaching of John the Baptist, and then, of course, Jesus as He appears. That's why we're reading the prophetic literature, because that's the only inspired account we have of that 400 years of silence. Well, there are significant things that happen during that period. It begins with the overthrow of the Persians and the Medes, as we've already seen through Alexander the Great, the male goat of Daniel's prophecy that destroys the ram of Persia. Now, this was the third world empire of the four that would rule, as Nebuchadnezzar's dream reminds us, before Messiah's kingdom would be set up. The first was Babylon, the second Persia, the third Greece, and the fourth, as we're going to see next week, Lord willing, was Rome. Now, what have we seen to this point with regard to the Grecian Empire? Well, not surprisingly, the Lord had a purpose for allowing Alexander to conquer the world. That purpose was the establishing of a common language of Greek. And we saw how this helped the cause of the gospel in several different ways. First of all, it gave the New Testament writers a language in which they could express in a very detailed and precise way what it means that Christ has come into the world, and explaining to us the significance of those things. So they were given a very precise language to write down God's revelation. It also allowed those Jews that were born and raised outside of Palestine access to the Old Testament Scriptures. Since they had been dispersed, many of them did not know Hebrew, and so they didn't know how to read the Hebrew Scriptures. But to remedy that situation, the 70 scholars we saw during this time of the 400 years of silence, during the time that Alexander was ruling, translated the Old Testament into Greek so that they could read it, and it became the standard version, as we saw in the synagogues. It was also the version of the Old Testament that was frequently quoted by Christ and the apostles. At the same time, it also exposed the Greek-speaking Gentiles to the Old Testament Scriptures to prepare them also for the time when they would be brought into Christ's kingdom. It allowed the apostles to preach the gospel everywhere in the world, everywhere in the Roman Empire, without learning those particular languages, because they all spoke Greek. And it also allowed them to write letters to the churches that could be circulated to the other churches, because they all spoke the same language. They could all read and write the same language. So the fact that they had a common language was a tremendous blessing to the progress of God's kingdom. And of course, again, we can use the fact that English is so widespread as an avenue to communicate the gospel to all the English-speaking nations, as well as the nations that have come here to learn English. But now that was the one blessing that Alexander's kingdom brought to the world. It also brought many challenges. Alexander and those who preceded him were not Christians. They were pagans. As a matter of fact, we're going to see an example this morning of how Alexander wanted to worship in a temple that was dedicated to Heracles, which is, I believe, the Greek equivalent of the Roman Hercules. which means he worshipped pagan gods. Well, Alexander and those who preceded him were pagans. They were idolaters. And as many pagans who have power wanted everyone in their kingdom to worship their gods, they wanted the Jews to worship their gods. And when the Jews were not willing to do that, as you can understand, if you lived in that same situation, you would not do that. They would be persecuted. A lot could be said about whether or not the world wants you to turn away from your Christianity, for all of us to turn away from our Christianity and worship the God of secularism, to worship atheism, to worship evolution. We're not going to turn away from that, or from Christianity for that. The Jews, of course, were not willing to give up the true religion to worship idols. Now, this morning we're going to consider 3 of these persecutions and how the Lord providentially, miraculously delivered them from each one of them. First, we'll see how the Lord delivered His people from Alexander when they refused to help him in his warfare against the city of Tyre. Secondly, we'll see how He delivered them from Ptolemy Philopater, who was actually one of the descendants of the 4 generals that succeeded Alexander, when they refused to let him go into the temple. Emperors are usually used to getting their own way, and they're not used to being rejected from anything that they ask. Well, in this case, they wouldn't let him in the temple, and for that he wanted to destroy them. And then we're going to see how He delivered them from Antiochus Epiphanes when they refused to worship his gods. Now, the application of all 3 of these points is going to be relatively simple. It doesn't require a great deal of explanation. God said He would preserve His church. We see God preserving His church in these examples through circumstances that we perhaps wouldn't have thought possible. Although reading the Bible, we certainly know that God is a God of miracles, and He can do what He will. Maybe things we don't think are possible today, but God has a way of doing it. The thing is that the God who saved His church then is the God who promises to protect His church now, and so we can look forward to that same blessing of protection. Well, first of all, let's consider how the Lord delivered His people from Alexander the Great when they refused to help him in his warfare against the city of Tyre. Now, during his campaigns against Persia, as he is conquering the world, Alexander sought to take the city of Tyre, which is in Phoenicia, that's north of the Promised Land, north of Canaan, on the coast. But it turned out to be a little bit harder than he anticipated. At first, Alexander, when he came to the city, offered to spare the city if they would just simply open up the doors to him and let him go into their temple, which he knew was in the city, which was the temple that was dedicated to Heracles. And if they would allow him to go in and worship there, he would spare the city. They told him, we're not going to open the gates for you. If you want to worship Heracles, go to the old city. And by the way, at this point, Tyre was no longer on the coast, but was built on an island that was just little ways off the coast, not far. Okay, very well fortified. They said, in the old city there's a temple to Heracles, you go worship Heracles there. And because the Tyrians refused, Alexander, of course, didn't take that lightly, he laid siege to the city. Now, this wasn't an easy thing to do because Tyre, as I've said, was built on an island. And they constructed it very well. They built the walls all the way up to the edge of the water. So the city is entirely surrounded by water, and there was no place for an enemy army to actually lay, their siege works and their devices to try to get to the city, and they're out of the range of their artillery. Well, so what did Alexander do? Well, he began by building a causeway to the city with the remains of the old city of Tyre, which was still there on the coast. In other words, he took all the rubble from the old city and he had his soldiers take it and throw it into the water, and they built a land bridge out to the island. That didn't solve all of his problems, but it did solve a number of them. Now, it is interesting, and I just want to diverge here for a moment, to see this as a wonderful answer to God's prophecy. He actually said this is what He was going to do. And it helps us when we see these things, as they're predicted years before they take place, that the Lord's word is true. Let me read to you what God said He was going to do to Tyre from the prophet Ezekiel. Son of man, because Tyre has said concerning Jerusalem, aha, the gateway of the peoples is broken, it is open to me. I shall be filled now that she is laid waste. In other words, gloating over Jerusalem's demise. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Tyre, and I will bring up many nations against you, as the sea brings up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and break down her towers, and I will scrape her debris from her and make her a bare rock. Also, they will make a spoil of your riches and a prey of your merchandise, break down your walls and destroy your pleasant houses, and throw your stones and your timbers and your debris into the water. So I will silence the sound of your songs, and the sound of your harps will be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock. You will be a place for the spreading of nets. You will be built no more. For I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the Lord God. Now this was spoken sometime, several hundred years actually, I believe, before the event actually took place. At least 100 years. I don't know the exact time. But Tyre, as a matter of fact, was scraped off of the surface of the earth and became a bare rock, and its stones and its timbers were thrown into the water to build the causeway for Alexander to get out to Tyre in order to lay siege to the city. And again, that siege was attended with several different circumstances that made it very difficult. But while he was laying siege to Tyre, he found that he was in need of some help. And you know, the Jews aren't very far away. So he sent to the Jews for help and for supplies. But the Jews refused to help him because they had made an oath with the king of Persia. Now, Alexander didn't take this too kindly. As you know, he was a man of swift action, as he's represented as the goat coming across from the west without even touching the ground, shattering the ram, and there was no one to deliver the ram. So he set out immediately to destroy them. But as he approached Jerusalem, the priests came out to meet him, decked out in their holy attire, and at that moment, the Lord simply changed Alexander's heart to spare them. In the same way that Esau had come against Jacob, remember when Jacob was in Paddan Aram and the Lord told him, go back to the promised land, and as he's going back to the land, he's concerned about Esau. You know, maybe Esau still hates me because I stole his blessing from him, and he might want to kill me. That's what he wanted to do when I left. So he sent messengers out, and the messengers came back and said, Esau is on his way out here to meet you with 400 armed men. So Jacob, first thing he does is he begins to pray, and then he divides his company into two peoples so that one company might be spared if Esau comes upon the other. And what ends up happening, of course, is when Esau sees him, the Lord changes his heart. And instead of trying to kill Jacob, he actually embraces Jacob as his brother and says, the Lord has blessed me anyway, and basically all is forgotten, all is forgiven. In the same way, the Lord changed Alexander's heart. Alexander came out to destroy the Jews, but when he saw the priests coming to him, the Lord turned his heart and he spared them. You see, God is true to his promise to protect his church and to advance his kingdom. Now, secondly, let's consider how he delivered his people from Ptolemy Philopater when they refused to let him enter into their temple. Now, after Alexander died, his kingdom was divided into 4 different areas. It was basically given to 4 captains. Now, that's what's represented by the 4 horns that we saw in this image. That there were 4 horns that grew out. Okay, it was in verse 8. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, which refers to Alexander's death at a young age. And in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. The 4 quadrants of his kingdom were divided between these 4 captains. One of them was given to a general who inherited Egypt, and he took the name Ptolemy, and so did his successors. Now, the first Ptolemy was called Ptolemy Lagus. After him was Ptolemy Philadelphus. After him, Ptolemy Evergetes, and then Philopater, that is Ptolemy Philopater. And Philopater is the one who interests us now. Philopater happened to be known as a very cruel tyrant and a man who was known as a drunkard and a partier and so forth. Now, he didn't have much respect, of course, for the people that were under his authority and in their kingdom. And so when he went to Jerusalem during an expedition to Syria in order to conquer it, he wanted to enter into the temple. But the Jews, of course, would not let him because only Jews can enter into the temple. Now, when the Jews wouldn't let him, he was, as you might guess, enraged. First of all, he began to punish the Jews that were living in the seat of his kingdom. He was king over Egypt. At that time, he built up the city of Alexandria. Alexandria was a very important city during those days. It housed one of the world's largest libraries, and when that library was burned up, there were books that were lost to us, I think, forever. Probably just as well, because they weren't books that would have profited us anyway. But anyway, it was a very important center of learning, very important to the Western world. But what he did was he punished the Jews who were living in Alexandria, which was his hometown, by subjecting them to slavery, branding them with a hot iron. Now, the only way that they could avoid the branding and the slavery was to offer a sacrifice to his gods. You see this recurring motif. When you have a king who is an authority and he has a particular god that he's devoted to, he wants all of his subjects also to be devoted to them. Now, out of the thousands of Jews who lived in Alexandria, only 300 of them complied. The rest of them refused. When the rest of the Jewish community went beyond that and excommunicated the 300 who had compromised, Philopater decided he would destroy the whole nation, beginning with the Jews who lived in Alexandria. So he ordered all of them to be brought to a place called the Hippodrome, a huge arena that was outside the city, that was used for public races, public events, basically what we would call a sports arena. And he commanded that as the Jews are gathered together, 500 elephants be let loose at one time to trample them all to death. Now, on the first day that this was to take place, the king failed to show up because he had been involved in some kind of a drunken party the night before. So he overslept, and the event was postponed to the next day. The next day, the same thing happened. The king didn't show up. But the third day, the king was present. The Jews were gathered, and the elephants were let loose. But instead of trampling the Jews, the elephants instead trampled the spectators and the soldiers. Now that, along with a few other things that happened, caused the king to become afraid of his plot to kill the Jews, and he ended up sparing them. So again, the Lord spared his people. God is true to his promise to protect his church and to advance his kingdom. God will protect you. He will protect me. Now finally, let's consider how he delivered his people from Antiochus Epiphanes when they refused to worship his gods. This is perhaps the greatest act of mercy the Lord showed to his people. Antiochus Epiphanes was the successor of another of Alexander's 4 kings, or captains, known for his cruelty to the Jews. He came to the throne of Syria. By the way, Syria is just north of Israel. Egypt, of course, is south of Israel. And Israel is kind of in between. They're that natural land bridge, where all the nations kind of have to come through. So the king just to the north as well as the king to the south had something to do with the Jews. Now, his main complaint against the Jews was that they refused to give up their religion and worship his gods, his idols. And his persecution of them was severe. He began by killing Jews in the country, and he killed many in Jerusalem. He was the one who was notorious for abolishing the Jewish worship altogether and profaning the temple of God. The first thing he did was, when he conquered the city, he went into the temple and sacrificed a pig on the altar. A pig, is an unclean animal and could not be used in sacrifice. And he did that to spite the Jews. Then he set up idols, his idols in the temple. You won't worship my gods, I'll bring my gods to your idol. Now, he wanted not only to destroy the Jewish religion, but he wanted to destroy the nation as a whole, and particularly he wanted to destroy every copy he could find of the law. It's interesting how Satan hates that law and wants to exterminate it, as well as the worship of God. That's why we have the difficulties that we have today. And there were many times when it seemed as though he was going to succeed. On one occasion, he sent this vast army against the Jews, intending to kill all the men and to spare just the women and children to have them sold as slaves. And it looked like, because of the size of the army, that they were going to be successful, that thousands of merchants actually attended or came with the army with money in their hands so that they could buy the slaves once the war was finished. But the Lord changed things on that particular occasion. Raised up a man by the name of Judas Maccabeus, who delivered the Jews with a very small army. It actually had begun a little bit earlier when he raised up a particular priest by the name of Mattathias. He rallied a large group of men in the country who were Jewish, who were willing to fight and even to die for their religion and for their country. Now, when he died in 166, he was succeeded by his son, Judas the Maccabee. And by the way, that's where we get the book of Maccabees. It's an historical account of this particular event. Maccabee basically means the hammer. So here we have Judas the hammer, who with a small group of men was successful in defeating the Syrians, also was able to cleanse the temple and restore the temple worship service. The event is the event that we just read about in our scripture reading this morning. Think about, well, let me just read it to you again so you can see the correlation. The male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. Seems to be a reference to Satan, perhaps, and his energizing this particular villain. It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him. And the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." In chapter 11, verses 31 and 32, we read this: "Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action." That's referring to Judas Maccabeus and those who with him were able to defeat the Syrians and were able to cleanse the temple. Isn't it interesting how everything the Lord says comes about just precisely as He said it? Now notice the abomination of desolation. It's not referring to a future abomination, but rather to this particular one. And I believe that most dispensationalists would agree this one was referring to that desecration of the temple. The one we disagree on has to do with the one Jesus was referring to in Matthew 24, which is the ones the Romans did when they burned the temple to the ground. It's not a future rebuilt temple with an Antichrist and so forth, but rather it was again the desolation of the temple at Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now this one's talking about what happened in the days of Antiochus. Now the Lord brought Antiochus to a miserable end through a terrible disease that affected not only his body, but also his mind. I think you'll find that happen quite a bit in the lives of these tyrants. In Daniel 11:45, we read about it. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. We need to realize the Lord doesn't take it lightly when somebody puts out his hand to injure his church in any way. God will destroy them. He is true to his promise to protect his church. He will advance his kingdom. Now, remember that the care that the Lord showed to his church in those days is the same that he shows to us today. We are as much a part of God's plan of his history of redemption as those Jews were in those days. I think that if we suffer persecution, and we do to some degree, but not to that degree, if we were to suffer persecution in this generation, and then years from now, a successive generation of Christians were to read about us, I think they would see something very similar to what we have just read or what we've just seen in these passages. That yes, the church was persecuted, but yes, the Lord brought about a providential deliverance. He delivered His people as He said He would. God is true. It's always easy to read history and see it there and say, yes, God is faithful, but when we get into the middle of a situation, we tend to think maybe He isn't, and we become afraid. We don't trust the Lord. But like I said, just put our situation in the past. Think about future Christians reading about our situation and know that God is going to work this one out in the same way that He worked those out. Maybe if we put it in that perspective, in the past, then we'll trust the Lord. We can trust Him. You see, no matter what He allows as far as how things go for His church, He will never allow her to perish. He will never allow us to perish. And that truth should encourage us. I think the one thing that usually gets in our way more than anything else is simply fear. Fear of doing what the Lord calls us to do. We're afraid people are going to reject us. They're not going to like us. They might get angry at us. They might call us nasty words. They might throw things at us. They might want to retaliate in some other way. And I think, of course, one good example of something like that happening is the McElhaney's in San Francisco. I think it was during the 70s or 80s, sometime in that time frame, when they hired the organ player that turned out to be a homosexual. And when they found out, of course, they removed him from that position. That brought on all kinds of persecution, death threats, fire bombs. It was a daily occurrence. And yet, now that that's several years in the past, you can look at that same situation and you can say the Lord providentially delivered them from all harm. Yes, they did have to suffer a few things. There was danger, there was trouble, there was the question of are we going to survive this or not? But they did survive it. It actually brought them much closer together as a family. It actually strengthened them spiritually in their resolve and to fight against these particular things. And so when the mayor of San Francisco declared homosexual marriage to be legal, the first person who brought the lawsuit against them was Chuck McElhaney, because the Lord had strengthened him through that previous battle, and he won that battle in court. So again, that's history now. But during that time he was going through that, he could claim these promises, and as a matter of fact, he did claim these promises, and the Lord brought him through it. And He will bring us also through these things. We don't have to be afraid. God has a vested interest in bringing His plan to completion. And you know, there is nothing in heaven or earth that can resist His will, as Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 8. So let's not be afraid. Let's learn to trust the Lord in all things. And make sure that you are walking with Him. Because the promise doesn't apply to you if you step out of bounds, as it were, if you're not trusting in the Lord to begin with, or if you're following a course of disobedience, then it's not going to apply to you. It applies to you when you're walking with Him, when you truly are the Lord. So make sure that you are trusting in Christ, that you are submitting to His will, that you are doing what the Lord calls you to do, and He will make sure that no one touches the apple of His eye. Well, let's spend a few moments in prayer and let's ask the Lord to apply this to us.